right. All right, everybody. Thanks for attending Q4 ROS Industrial Community Get Together. We're excited to kind of share some of the recent activities over the last quarter and some of the things we're thinking about working on as we get into 2024. So without further ado, let me get back to Zoom. I want to be able to monitor it in case people pop in. Let me go ahead and open the participant window and the chat. Great. I'll try to be monitoring everything. So again, thanks again for coming. Happy end of year, right? So I'm wearing a jacket, so it's even kind of cool in San Antonio, right? In December. So without further ado, we can get going. Here's today's agenda. We've only had this one set for an hour. I know sometimes these go an hour and a half. It's the end of the year. I didn't necessarily get a lot of clamoring feedback for members to share anything. But we have a few things that we wanted to share. There's been some new workshops. There's been some requests and work on training, some different things going on, right? So I have Michael Rippiger online today and Tyler. I think both of them are either on the road or officially on vacation with family, but they took this time to share some of the stuff that's going on. This is actually probably my last day in the office too, right? But anyways, we also want to give the update because SWORD is built on consortium member feedback about ease of use and being able to leverage engineering tools, i.e. CAD. We did want to say where we were on the SWORD release. After that, we have some time for just Q&A. So I do, this is a version of this slide that Michael created. I've been repurposing, but again, we tried to put the vision up front. That said, as some of you know who've supported the consortium directly, I know some of you are a community, is that we've sort of migrated from a time-based roadmap a little bit more towards this. I would call it qualitative, but still our pillars of focus, right, that were built on member feedback. We have now an opportunity to potentially go back globally because some of the other regions are doing a little bit more going back to a time-based roadmap. We may be going back and looking at this now and trying to line out specific initiatives and things that we want to achieve by certain times. So that'll help basically align our funding and really give us maybe a little bit more concise, let's just say quantitative things that we're going to try to get done in a certain time. So stay tuned for that. I'll be convening certain consortium members at the Consortium Advisory Committee to further those discussions as we get into 24, particularly probably some face-to-face time at the annual meeting, and I'll touch on that in a minute. Speaking of feedback, one thing I like to do at the end of the year is share kind of a high-level snapshot of things people have been talking about and asking about. So some of you, if you have attended any of our face-to-face gatherings or interacted with us at the various events we go to, we do try to collect a lot of the feedback and turn this into things that, hey, are we working on things that make sense? And so these are sort of the big three things that kind of emerged from some of the data collection over the last year. And so basically it's learning resources. How do we get to more consistent behavior, particularly for interfaces, and this notion of usability of existing tools. So hold on a second. I'm going to make a co-host just in case my computer dies. All right. So Michael, you're online. I made you host, just heads up. Because I hear my computer starting to whir up, and sometimes these applications cause my computer to crash. But a real just tough couple things these are things that we're actively working on. But one thing that's come out is there's, as some OEMs are embracing and doing more to support their interfaces here in the middle column, there's definitely some inconsistencies to how they behave. And I'll touch a little bit later on about an initiative that's going to kick off that we actually just sort of launched yesterday globally to talk about revisiting kind of best practices. So as OEMs are wanting to engage the ROS ecosystem and even this community specifically, we want to make sure we're providing. We used to maintain a manipulator, so to speak, driver specification. We're backing the verbiage off of that a little bit because we still want to we want to entice OEMs to support their interfaces. So we're just going to call it best practices and then maybe reshape it a little bit and talk a little bit about some of the approaches, because we are seeing a different approach, right? Whether it's ROS control or how we've seen Yaskawa use the micro ROS. So we don't want to like over constrain the OEMs, right? But at the same time, there is this notion of consistent performance or an anticipated like behavior, and it's expected, and basically the fact that like enticing them to optimize for kind of how their approach. Other than that, we're talking about usability of existing tools, and we'll touch a little bit on that, right? So we're getting a lot of inquiries about this web-based approach, and some of these other things around tools to enable some of these other resources to enable better ROS application development and deployment. So anyways, so I kind of already kind of stole the lead on this one, right? So one of the things that came up around manipulators is like, well, hey, what about industrial core for these old drivers in ROS2? So currently right now, the practice is to bridge it. So we did have somebody initiate a port of industrial core that launched then Jeremy Zoss here in our organization to start porting it. It's incomplete, but they are willing to take a look at contributions. If you really, really have a need for a legacy manipulator and interested in seeing a port of industrial core, we're not just going to do it. Let's just say for no reason. We are really trying to get everybody to row along and proceed to using ROS2. And we're doing our best to support bridge implementations. We have some other interesting things relative to supporting bridge. And there are now a number of manipulators that are supporting ROS2, and this is just the short list of, so to speak, ROS-I friendly. Obviously, the first two are members, and there is an ABB driver out there that's ROS2. And since the ABB is not currently, let's just say, proactively supporting, but they did help. They did work with Picnic to deploy that driver, right? So it's from what we know, it's functional. So, but obviously we want to highlight OEM engagement, right? To entice other OEMs to support. So one is like, hey, why don't you create a performant interface that meets some level of requirements and expectation? That could be around latency, could be around update rate, those sorts of things, access to the robot IO. And currently right now, that's a little bit inconsistent from OEM to OEM. So we are, again, hence where we're going to try to create a document to support that wish list, if you will. So, and in the meantime, we'll always, like, so to speak, highlight our OEMs who are actively working to support the ROS ecosystem. Historically, right, so this is the whole industrial core piece, right? When I mentioned it, like how there was simple message in particular, right? And then interacted with vendor-specific things, right? So this is the old ROS Oneway. This is part of like basically the ROS-I wiki. Moving forward, it looks a little bit more like this. I did cover this at the last quarter community meeting. We just had one of our team members, Doug Smith, do some additional work on the bridge where he's got it working actions for Humble. And so ideally, we're coming up with tricks and techniques. So currently, Tyler, who's on the phone, did some work recently creating a container that like basically bundles a Noetic and Foxy and then can communicate with a Humble system. So now we even have an implementation that's running just Humble, right? So you can go right from Noetic to Humble. The question is like, what level do we support that, right? So is a container approach a little bit more supportable or sustainable? I think it might be on a case-by-case basis. We'll have to take a look at the two different approaches and then provide some recommendations and resources to the community as we figure out which way is better. There will be a blog post and some additional information coming out about this latest bridge implementation. Humble is an LTS, but I believe it sunsets mid-year next year. Tyler or Michael, do you happen to know off your head, top of your head, when Humble is supposed to be supported through? You may not. So I'd have to go look at the distro notes.
Yeah, I'm not sure when it sunsets. I can look it up real quick and put it in the chat.
That's fine. But either way, like we have a fully working bridge that we'll make available with some, like I said, a write-up about it for Humble. So if you are still using ROS1 drivers on your manipulator side, there will now be a bridge option in Humble to go grab and use. Like, again, under consideration whether this is something we do every LTS. And I mentioned this as well. Historically, we've supported basically a robot driver specification. We are now like EO, oh, 27. Oh, great. Thanks, Michael. And thinking a little bit more about best practices in the context there, right? So this will likely be maintained on rosindustrial.org as opposed to the old wiki, because the wiki is sort of migrated. We have talked about like creating some of this guidance documentation in like a read the docs format, still under consideration, but very likely this will start over at the revamped rosindustrial.org. And I'll touch on that in a little bit for those who don't remember what we mentioned last quarter. Like I said, this is in the planning phase. Actually, we just had the global ROS Industrial Consortium meeting yesterday morning and cooked this all up, right? So we want to create some templates or a template for basically what are these best practices and circulate it for review. The template and first drafts will probably hopefully be ready by the second or third week of January. That's somewhat time sensitive. But then like after that, we can circle it around for those interested in say like the ROS-I community. Maybe we'll post it for even comment somewhere. We'll figure that out, right? So the key is to provide better guidelines for OEMs to provide a little bit more consistent experience if they're choosing to support the ROS ecosystem. Michael and has shared a little bit about some of this and has some of these documents. And we know, for instance, in Tesseract, there's a little bit of like, hey, debate about a roadmap. Nethers, this is the one that's kind of like spelled out. We've been really trying to, since Michael's done work on this, since you see here the date's 21, right? We've been really trying to, even though at a high level I mentioned our roadmap wasn't time-based, we are still sitting there thinking about specific capabilities, things like calibration, things like this is toolpath planning and what we're doing for motion planning frameworks to basically, push them towards ease of use, usability, maybe not grab and go, but like make it a little bit more, let's just say, ramp up and get something working. So I just want to remind this community, Michael's going to talk a little bit about some technical activity. Tyler's going to talk about an update to Tesseract. These are all in the vein of, getting something where you're not scratching your head when it's not working right out of the box, right? So that's along this vein. So we look forward to sharing when these sorts of write-ups come out. So for instance, this update roadmap for Nether is, I believe it's under a discussion out on the GitHub ROS Industrial/Nether. You can go up under discussions and you'll see it up there. So we look forward to replicating that for other key repositories. So training. So currently right now, this is the training schedule. I don't have it up on rosindustrial.org. We basically have, through some workshops completed lately, we could offer up some suggestions for different focused or advanced topics. We're open to suggestions, right? So if you are if your organization is regularly attending training events, we do want to offer new content at a relatively, when it makes sense. The other thing we like to do is we also like to take training events to other parts of the country, right? So it's obviously we love having everyone here in San Antonio. We're happy to share you some of the best fajitas that North America has to offer, but we understand that sometimes there's an advantage to having the training events in other regions, right? So if your organization, if you are a consortium member and you're interested in hosting a training event, just email me directly. You can find my information over on LinkedIn. I'm pretty easy to find, either through the ROS Industrial website, or obviously for a lot of you on the phone or on this call, you have my email address already and phone number. But just shoot a note to me, and we can talk about getting that set up. So like I said, we do try to hop around. Shout out to Rensselaer Polytechnic. They hosted a training event in their campus in New York last year. A year before that, Analog hosted one in Boston. Boeing hosted one in Seattle. Caterpillar is hosted in Central Illinois. So these have been really nice to kind of bounce and hop around, having these training events. Typically, the cost associated to a hosting organization is just the travel of the trainers. And depending on what we want to do for any kind of lab exercises, if we have to ship equipment. More recently, we haven't had to do that, right? If you have URs in your lab, we don't need to bring a UR. So anyways, a really neat opportunity, right? We typically allow allow hosts to exceed their typical limit because they are hosting. Anyway, we also are still looking for training topics / workshops. So I know this is we've been trying to add a little bit more lab content on day 3 of training. But I think right now we have perception pipeline, and we've been doing some stuff on motion planning, like tuning a motion planning pipeline, which is pulled out of the scan and plan workshop. So it gives people a little bit of exposure to TrajOpt and all of the setting of constraints, setting up planning profiles, using the tools there in associated with TrajOpt and Tesseract. We are open to some other suggestions. So if there's something interesting, we would encourage the community to shoot a note. Again, you can just shoot a note to me directly, post it up on Discourse. There's a number of different ways to kind of get these suggestions over to us. So I encourage you to kind of give some thought about that. If your organization has attended training and would like to see something or have specific gaps, like for instance, we see a lot of comments on calibration. So if you're interested in doing a focus day on calibration, we had done that in the past. So there was a special topic on calibration probably in 2018. So we could obviously take that under advisement to dust that off and see if we can get it ready for one of the trainings in the upcoming calendar year. We also had feedback for bite-sized learning. We're still working on this. We've been focusing a little bit more on creating short tutorial videos on SWORD. So just doing general topics, that delivering these has slipped a little bit. But if there's a way to kind of prioritize what we do bite-sized learning on, again, shoot a note to me. I'll be the point of contact to collect that feedback. So look forward to that. So Michael may touch on it, but Michael has been the workshop guy lately. So thank you, Michael, for going around the world essentially and putting on workshops. The one was closed, right? ROS-Con 23. He put on a REACH workshop that was generally well received. And the nice thing is what we've done more recently is when we have the opportunities to do something where we're showcasing a functionality, is to build that in a way that it's repurposable, right? So we could actually leverage this workshop potentially as a focus topic as part of a ROS-I training, if you think REACH is of value. Similarly, Michael had to put on a master class on tuning motion planning parameters just recently at the AP workshop in Singapore, which was really interesting. A lot of really great content coming out of ROS-I AP workshop, including like the revisit of how we do road mapping for the consortia across the world and making sure those are a little bit more aligned. So stay tuned for content coming out about that. But Michael recently put on that master class as well. And we've been more recently, for members in particular, putting on Tesseract introduction workshops. TBD whether or not we just make that sort of a standard workshop, but these have been a little bit more, let's just say, a benefit to member kind of introduction workshops when you really feel like you need to start diving into something like Tesseract. So those are more on as request basis for members. But there is more of this content coming on, and we look forward to whether it's REACH, something on motion planning pipeline, or something like a Tesseract introduction. We're open to hosting these at member sites. You can always do these sort of closed door. We can do them. I'd like to make it a broad event to get others exposed to these tools. So if your organization is interested in like just a workshop as opposed to like say a 3-day training event, this could be an interesting option as well. Just feel free to contact me and we can talk about how we can collaborate on that. I have mentioned this before. It was hoping to be launched around ROS-Con. We have dropped the ball largely on me as well. It's just, it's hard to spend time just working on the website. It's finicky. It's a lot of changes. We are trying to make something a little bit more. There's a lot of debate about graphics. But we look forward to getting this officially rolled out. We hope it makes a tighter connection between things on GitHub and then resources that are like, say, not on GitHub, which are a little bit more, different press, publications, video archives, some of the other like learning content, making this a much more usable one-stop shop to tie between, developer activities and say more administrative or decision maker tools. So stay tuned. We're really hoping to get this off the ground in 24. Again, a little bit like the best practices for driver, which will live here as well. There's a little bit of time sensitivity to this now at this point. So So we hope like be able to get this off the ground in January 24. If you have any feedback recommendations for content that should be on rosindustrial.org to make it more useful, again, feel free to shoot me a note. Happy to take that under advisement. Another thing I wanted to share before launching into tech content is we will be doing a 2-day event. So for those who've made it to the annual meeting the last couple of years, we've co-located with Automate. The Automate tradition was fine because Automate was every other year. So we could come back to San Antonio on the off years. But now that Automate's every year, we're just like, okay, we're just going to go back to San Antonio on the even years, and then we'll do Automate odd years. So the nice thing about coming to San Antonio is that we can make it a little longer, and then we take advantage of our lab space to allow members to host either just like a chance to share what they're working on, a little bit more like say tour lab space, even do demonstrations. So a lot of cases the members have brought demos. So our robot is actually doing something. In some cases, they bring their own robots, but of course, we can help them get access to robots because we have robots here. And that really makes it much more interactive as opposed to hanging out and gathering around tables and PowerPoint slides in a conference room. We can actually like have conversations around lab hardware and see some things in action. So this is really interesting. I'll probably be pinging each member a little bit more about like, hey, are you interested in showing something? What is it you would like to see? We're even talking about bolting on an extra day for something that's a little bit more for the developers too, right? So we have this availability. It is I'm gonna click on my calendar here, bear with me, because I always slip up the dates. It is the 27th and 28th of March, so that last Wednesday, Thursday. So we could always bolt on, like to say Tuesday for some little hands-on workshop, like i.e. you want to get exposed to tuning motion planning pipelines, or we want to play around with Reach, or a little bit more hands-on with Sword or Tesseract more broadly. These are things we can take under advisement. So feel free to shoot me that feedback again. I will be contacting each member directly relative to planning for ROS-I annual meeting in San Antonio. So stay tuned. There is a listing over on rosindustrial.org with a super high level agenda. So feel free to check that out. I did want to send, this is very brief because in the third quarter, I talked a little bit about the technical development hasn't necessarily been so fast since then, right? Due to things beyond our control. But the FTP between Steel Founder Society, Push Corp, Yaskawa, I'm probably blanking on another contributing org, Iowa State University, ourselves, with some in-kind support from Aris Technology and Edison Molding Institute, and Fisher Cast Steel, is a little bit delayed due to some building issues. That said, right, some interesting contributions have come out, right? In particular, just recently on Nether, if you do something that, like, say, selects a sub mesh, you can visualize just that sub mesh. So here you can see the toolpaths there. They just zoomed in the video, but you didn't actually see the sub mesh, right? Like a sub region on that reconstructed mesh, right? So now you can visualize sub mesh. So if you're doing some sort of segmentation, you can actually visualize that result. So that's a really nice little add-on for folks interested in doing different types of segmentation. Over on Scan and Plan Workshop, there's been some other additions and some, really investigating the use of containers to ease of deployment, right? So stay tuned for some things that come out about that. We're still kind of poking at like the best way to take advantage of containerization. But obviously, if your organization has feedback, questions, by all means, reach out to us. And with that, I can pass the mic, if you will, to Michael Ripperger. I think I have you up first. Michael, are you able to share?
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
You sound loud and clear.
Excellent. Let me put these slides here. Okay. Can you see this PDF?
Yeah, we can see it loud and clear, or loud and clear visually.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, PowerPoint doesn't really behave super well for me on Linux, so I'm going to share this PDF instead. But yeah, so as far as tech updates go for this meeting, it's a little bit light. Matt, you kind of touched on a lot of the things I'm going to talk about, so I'll give a little bit more context on some of these pieces. But you mentioned Reach workshop that we did at ROSCON. So this year, again, they were doing sort of a day 0 classes. So I think they hosted like 4 or 6 classes. I think it was 4. I think there were 2 all-day classes and then 4 half-day classes or something like that. But they had a class on the reach study workshop for half day. Had pretty good attendance. I think there's maybe 35 or 40-ish people there. So it was a decent sized class. But basically we put on this workshop about, say, how do you use this reach package to do reach studies in ROS, with the idea being like, hey, let's give a little bit of introduction about like how the tool works and sort of what our nominal use cases are. And then also spend quite a bit of time talking about sort of non-standard reach studies that you can do with this tool that you might not think about when you think of reach studies. So I thought it was kind of interesting. We do stuff like this fairly often at Swery, where we have maybe complicated robot setups, or we're trying to do things where you just may not think of being able to do a reachability analysis, but you can. So that's sort of the content that we covered in this class. And so these are some pictures of our sort of non-standard reachability analysis examples that we covered. And so one of them was sort of reachability analysis for pick and place. So basically, like, it's a little bit different, right? Because you don't necessarily have a fixed set of ways. We wanted to sort of generate an arbitrarily sort of random series of waypoints that might represent, pick points on boxes in a bin or something like that. And so that's one of the examples. And the second example is mobile manipulation, right? If we have this sort of propeller blade or something like that, where we have a mobile manipulator and we want to sort of be able to do inspection on that, right? Like, how do we set up a reach study and how do we configure it so it's successful and gives us results that look reasonable and give us some sense of how that robot's going to perform. So anyway, so we put this together in a separate repo. So I've added the link here. I think I still have yet to upload the slides. So it's on my sort of short to-do list of things to do, but I wanted to share this repo if you guys are interested in sort of having a more kind of pre-built class that you can kind of look at online for reachability. And kind of like Matt was mentioning too, if this is of interest to any of you guys, let us know. We could potentially incorporate this as like a day 3 sort of thing as part of like the ROS-I training, or if this is something that you want to spend maybe like a day or half a day on, that's probably something that we could set up sort of as a remote training session as well. Or if you just want to take the content and try it yourself and then send us some questions, I'm perfectly happy to sort of help and support with that.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
On the mobile manipulator reach, so I mean, how do you interface with this? I mean, you do plan ahead? I mean, is it like a planner, or is it just something it'll check and give you a report of what is reachable or something like that? So how is this module set up?
Yeah, it's more the latter. So there's no motion planning involved, and nominally it's sort of like a codified process for sort of intelligently solving IK for HIDOF systems. And so there's some interfaces that the user provides. One of them is, hey, how do we generate these sort of target waypoints? How do we solve IK for those? And then sort of the special sauce is that it does kind of discrete optimization to make sure it doesn't just solve IK once for all of these, some iterative process to help you find sort of a best case IK solution. And for systems with high degree of freedom, like mobile manipulators, where you have maybe a 5 or 6 DOF task space, but a 9 DOF or 10 DOF robot, right? It helps you find sort of best case IK solutions. And so the output from this is basically, we'll show you, hey, for this set of waypoints, how many of these waypoints can you reach? We also sort of bake in the concept of scoring IK poses based on some criteria that the user can provide. We have some things out of the box like manipulability and distance from joint limits and stuff like that can actually give you sort of a single number for each of these poses about how well you think the robot solved for that. And so basically at the end of the day, we can kind of generate sort of a single number for this robot configuration and say, hey, if I have this specific robot model with these limits and constraints, on this particular application, it scored this number. And so we've used this quite a bit when we have multiple different robot configurations that we're thinking about building or thinking about deploying for the same application. And then that gives us sort of a single number that we can compare and say, oh, if I chose this robot configuration, I decided to go with that configuration because it scored a higher number compared to some of these other options I tested. And in the same vein too, we can also sort of, for like mesh-based applications like this, we can actually sort of produce a heat map of reachability with those scores from every waypoint sort of projected onto the mesh. And so that can give you some sort of qualitative sense too about, hey, this robot configuration did really well on most of it, except for this, area over here. And then you can kind of look at that between different robot configurations. Or, if you're settled on a single robot configuration, you might throw some different parts in here and say, I want this same robot to be able to do, inspection on these different types of blades. And you can get some sense about, if it's going to be successful in all of them, or, if there might be things that you need to change in terms of like where this blade is positioned relative to the robot and some other things that can maybe ahead of time help you build out a more successful, more robust like system. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it did. I think I get. So during our ROS Industrial meeting in May, I think you mentioned something called meta planning.
Right.
Is it same as this, or is that something else entirely different?
Yeah, I think meta planning it's actually kind of similar to this, but I think it would be we've set it up kind of completely independently of this. So Tyler's actually going to talk a little bit more about some work that we've been doing on the same lines as this meta planning idea, but I think it's kind of similar conceptually, but set up quite a bit differently.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Yeah. And so I think I guess our plan sort of long term for meta planning and those things is I think a little bit more to try to bake them into like tasks that can be sort of inserted into these like tesseract pipelines that we've been working on. So we have sort of this concept in tesseract of a computation graph of different planning tasks that take inputs and produce outputs and sort of form this pipeline of things that we're going to do to create motion planning. And so Tyler,
I'm going to touch on specifically talking about using custom tasks and stuff.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll let you talk about that, but I think that's sort of the long-term play for some of these meta planning things, is to kind of take those ideas, turn them into tasks, and put them into sort of these tesseract pipelines, as opposed to maybe sort of our first approach, which was setting them up as sort of separate libraries that kind of invoke planners and IK solvers and stuff as like the actual planner themselves. But yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. So next on my list here is some updates that Matt also mentioned about Nether, our toolpath planning library. Yeah, so we've done a little bit of work recently, like Matt was saying, for this blending project, trying to do sort of mesh segmentation based on color boundaries, with the idea here being that, somebody can like draw some sort of polygon or circle or whatever on an object. We perceive it, we can see the colors on the mesh, and then basically we want to sort of identify some region that an operator has circled, and then extract that out of the mesh. And so one of the challenges we've run into recently is that color detection algorithm hasn't worked super well, and it hasn't been totally obvious like what was being segmented out of the mesh. We weren't really visualizing it, and so we've gone back to this Nether toolpath planning GUI that we introduced somewhat recently and sort of added that capability. And so nominally what we had seen previously in this GUI was it just showed you sort of the original mesh and sort of all of the sort of final toolpaths, including all modifications you wanted to make to them. And that's somewhat useful, but not always useful. So in the case for this like particular example here, we had a dummy mesh modifier that just kind of cut the mesh in half and produced two sub meshes. And so if you kind of look at the toolpaths on the left, it's kind of confusing about what's happening there. But then if we sort of break it down and say, okay, well, I see that, this toolpath planning pipeline generated two meshes. We can also sort of visualize these modified meshes, right? Like the resultant sub meshes that come out. And we can also show what toolpath was sort of generated pre-modification on these different segments as well. So that's kind of useful too. And then we can sort of toggle sort of any combination of those. So we can show the modified meshes with the final modified toolpaths. We can show the modified meshes with the original toolpaths. We can show sort of the original mesh with the original toolpaths. So I think this is sort of a step in the right direction to sort of getting a little bit more information about understanding how these like toolpath planning pipelines are functioning, instead of just being able to look at sort of the input and the final output, and being able to look at some of the intermediate outputs. I think is going to be a little bit going to make it much easier for us to kind of debug when some of these planners don't really behave in a way that we want. So shout out to David Spielman for putting this together. But this was merged maybe this week or late last week. And so it's relatively new. So I just want to shed a little light on this. If you guys use this Nether toolpath planner, this is another feature to help you kind of use it a little bit more effectively. I wanted to touch on calibration as well. I think Matt mentioned this too. We do a lot of work on camera calibration. And so, you know, it's been on our radar for a long time now to sort of introduce, I guess, ROS-2 interfaces for calibration. So a little bit of background on these libraries. You guys might be familiar with this industrial calibration library. So that was sort of our first attempt at sort of putting together these sort of, like, I guess, ROS-enabled camera calibration and some of these other exotic calibrations that we were trying to do. And so I think that was something we started maybe 8 or 9 years ago. It's been out there for quite a while. But for those who are familiar with this library, it's got a lot of content, but it wasn't organized particularly well, and a lot of it sort of stagnated. And so maybe 5 or 6 years ago, we put together this robot cal tools library that tried to take sort of the important things out of industrial calibration, reorganize them a little bit more effectively, add things like unit tests and sort of like simulation to prove that the calibration works. And then it's got some kind of light ROS1 wrappers on, like, how do you put all this stuff together to actually do a couple types of calibrations. And so we've been working on that for a while, but there are some limitations there, right? It doesn't have ROS2 support, and you know, it's kind of grown a little bit organically over the years. So there's kind of a question mark about, hey, what do we do now? And so I would like to sort of take robot cal tools and kind of merge that stuff back into industrial calibration, right? And then I think we need a little bit of kind of reorganization with the way that robot cal tools is set up. And then I think with some of our findings from porting our other libraries sort of to be compatible with ROS1 and ROS2, I'd like to sort of apply that to robot cal tools as well, try to extract out as much of the non-ROS stuff as possible into kind of a core library, and then add interfaces in ROS1 and ROS2 for collecting calibration data, and sort of make those live in a separate place where they're sort of equivalent, but separate and sort of easy to maintain, because they're sort of small layers that just push the calibration stuff into the ROS ecosystem. So we got a project now at Swery where I've gotten some time and funding to kind of focus on this. So I've been making these updates on the main branch of industrial calibration. Not totally complete. I think we basically have all the capability of robot cal tools back in this main branch. And right now what we're working on is kind of adding the ROS1 and ROS2 layers back, and trying to think about how do we architect sort of the data collection and calibration pieces to make those ROS1, ROS2 layers sort of as small as possible, and to make them sort of as similar as possible. So, right, we can kind of make a ROS1 implementation, kind of copy paste, make a few changes, and have the ROS2 implementation and be able to sort of update those relatively easily. So as a part of that, we're sort of thinking about, like, how do we take some of these C++ nodes that we've written and maybe write them in Python instead to make them a little bit easier to understand and easier to modify in the future. And then, we talked about this for a long time, but having sort of GUI interfaces for calibration. So, it's a little bit more intuitive how to, like, provide all the data, how to collect all the right data for calibration, so you don't have to mess around with a bunch of launch files, and sort of really have to understand the guts of it. It would be nice if there was sort of a GUI-driven process. And so that's some stuff that we're thinking about as we're sort of developing these ROS-I, ROS-II interfaces. We got a little layout here too of some of the data collection and calibration pipeline that we're sort of thinking about to try to limit the amount of rework that we'll have to do for these like ROS-I and ROS-II layers. So, but yeah, when this is sort of complete, then I'll probably put together like a blog post to advertise this a little bit more. And like Matt was saying, if this is something of interest for training, right, I think this is something we could do maybe as a day 3 option, or as as maybe sort of a remote training as well. You can sort of send out data and talk about this sort of remotely. So some cool happenings there. And the last couple of things I want to talk about. Matt also touched on these, but just sort of usability improvements. You know, a lot of our applications for scan and plan have needed this ROS-I bridge, and we've kind of just copy pasted the repo from computer to computer, rebuilt it, lost track of what tag we were supposed to be using to make actions work, and the building of it is also sort of non-trivial. So recently we went together and added or created a Docker image for the Noetic to Foxy bridge. That way we can sort of just pull this image and then run it in a container, and not really have to worry about having to build it or run it on our computer, right? Like it's something that's sort of pre-configured and should just run out of the box and bridging sort of all topics from ROS-I to ROS-II. So if you guys are using this ROS-I bridge, check out this Docker image here. We put it on sort of a ROS industrial fork of the ROS-I bridge. And so sort of excited to have this container to make deployments a little bit easier. And like Matt mentioned too, one of our colleagues, Doug Smith, has been working on sort of getting a Noetic to Humble bridge. So the difficulty there, right, is ROS-I is not distributed on 2204. And so the way we're getting around that basically is some people have put together ROS-I packages on Conda that run on 2204. And so there was, I think, something that recently sort of got added to Conda to help support with like the correct Python version to make this sort of compatible. And so he has a working version of ROS-I bridge on 2204 with Humble and Noetic. And so now that we sort of have a working prototype of that, our next step is to also sort of create a Docker image for that, for our use cases where we've got deployments that want to run on Humble, but need to interface with ROS-I hardware. So keep an eye out for that. Again, we'll probably make a blog post when that's complete and try to sort of disseminate the information about where it lives and how it works and all that sort of stuff. And then final point here about usability, right? We're trying to sort of update Docker images for Tesseract as well. And so we've kind of gone back through a lot of these repositories, updated the CI and updated the Docker image that was produced for Tesseract. And so it's been nice because they're considerably smaller in size than some of the previous ones that we had been generating with industrial CI. And we're kind of doing this for the blending FTP for scan and plan as well, to be able to have a like containerized version of the scan and plan application to help with our deployments for the FTP. But then we also sort of run a lot of demos as well with scan and plan and various hardware setups. And so instead of, again, having to build all that stuff from source on your deployment machine, we're working towards having a container for those applications. So we can just pull the container or a couple of containers, run them on the machine, and be able to interface with hardware and run these sort of pre-built applications. And if you guys are wanting to set up scan and plan type systems as well, this can be beneficial for that too. So that'll probably also be something we'll share in a blog post when that's fully complete. So we're maybe probably a couple weeks away from having, I think, that full sort of deployment pipeline done and tested. So keep an eye out for that. But yeah, so that's all from me on tech updates. Happy to answer questions if you guys have them, or I can cede the floor to Tyler.
Pretty cool. Any questions from Michael while we got him? Hey, can you pop back up real quick?
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah, I see your slide count.
Which
maybe usability. Yeah, here. Right. So obviously, did you say, yes, you have it here. The link is for a pull request, right? for that?
No, the link here is just a link to the repo where we forked the ROS1 bridge, and that's got a link to the container as well. But
Okay.
like the container actually exists on the GitHub container registry, ROS Industrial,
Ah.
ROS1 bridge, Noetic Foxy. So if you just call Docker pull that thing, then you can get the container or the image for that we built for the bridge.
I'm just making sure I understand that. So, and thank you for including so much activity around calibration, right? So that was great to see. And I know it's something that's come up. We had to do our annual meeting virtually one year, and we had like a big like feedback session on calibration utilities. And yeah, I mean, at one time we had to have like this PhD guy do all the calibration internal work. So thank you, Michael, for your efforts on calibration. It always comes up.
And then I think there's some cool stuff we could do there too. I mean, I had some thoughts coming back from this ROS-I Asia Pacific meeting. Like there was a lot of talk about cloud computing, and it started making me wonder, like, is there some things that we can do with some of these tools that we have by like putting them on like AWS services or something, right? And maybe calibration is an okay one where, you know, if we build out this calibration application, maybe we can run it in the cloud and make sort of a web-based interface. If you like acquire all of your data, maybe you could like load it up to this cloud service and have it sort of produce the calibration for you, right? The sort of results, whatever. If you upload your images and some configuration information or whatever, like maybe there's some stuff there that we could do to make calibration even more easy, where you don't even have to like pull anything and build it. It's like you just go out to a website, and if you're okay sort of uploading the images you required of your calibration target, and you're doing, you know, some supported sort of basic types of calibration like hand-eye, extrinsic calibration, like maybe we could sort of do some stuff there around using some of these web services. But that's sort of on my to-do list, is to think a little bit more about which of these like ROS-I tools might sort of be a nice thing to, you know, have on a web service or something. So
Perfect.
food for thought.
No,
but
no, thank you, Michael. With that, given time, Tyler, are you ready to go?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm ready to go.
You should just be able to share directly.
All right. Yep, you should be able to see it. So a couple things I was going to talk about. The first thing was actually going to talk about custom test track tasks using plugins. So Michael kind of touched on this. And this isn't super new. Like this has been available in Test Track for a little bit, but I don't know how much we've directly talked about it. So currently we're doing this in the Scan and Plan workshop. If you follow this link, it takes you to this page where you can see these custom plugin tasks that we've actually made for the Scan and Plan workshop. We have a constant TCP speed, just time parameterization, and then we have a kinematic limit check just to make sure like all the joint velocities, positions are within bounds, which happens intrinsically in a lot of tasks, but we kind of just made a separate one. And then you can see the task flow diagram that can get produced of the task that we're actually doing. So this is for a Cartesian pipeline. So it does like a minimum length check to make sure you have enough waypoints, a traj-opt motion plan, discrete contact check to make sure you're not contacting anything. And then I have highlighted here our 2 custom tasks that you can just easily drop in. And so I highly encourage people to kind of take advantage of this. What's nice is you can have these custom tasks if there's a task not by default available in Tesseract or something that you want to do. Of course, you can make a pull request to Tesseract adding that, but you can also, if it's something that you're developed or maybe your company doesn't want you contributing back to open source for whatever reason, you can kind of develop something proprietary that you can use. So it allows for easily developing and incorporating these custom proprietary tasks while still fully leveraging Tesseract. It's not like you have to completely separate from it or even make a fork of Tesseract or anything like that. So we used it for a Siri project, kind of like Michael was alluding to, similar to this meta planner process. So basically we would feed in a toolpath and then we'd get out a cleaned toolpath with waypoints removed. And it was incorporated into our motion planning pipeline, just like you see in this diagram here. But it was all in one instance. And because it's incorporated into this motion planning pipeline, we can fully take advantage of the parallelization that Tesseract allows with these task flows. So we could have multiple of these tasks running at the same time. And then this decision graph where if it fails, it goes to this other fallback planner. And it just is really nice to be able to fully take advantage of all the Tesseract capabilities with these custom planners, and then not have to worry about, like I said, forking Tesseract to implement our own things. So I just encourage that use. And then also, I think this could potentially be a good candidate for a ROS-I training task if people are interested in that. And Matt was talking about getting info from the community or feedback from the community on what they'd like to see. I've thought previously that this would be a good example of implementing basically a custom task from scratch. So you can see everything that's involved with that. And I will also say, because this is somewhat new in Tesseract, there's kind of frequent updates happening where we are having to make some changes or some breaking changes as we're kind of working through the kinks of realizing how exactly this is best implemented, or what is fundamentally required for each task versus what is specific to certain tasks. So as we work through that, you have to make there's some breaking changes that go through this, but it's gotten to a pretty stable place at this point. And then the other thing, which Matt mentioned I'd touch on, is Cartesian tolerance waypoints. It's in a pull request in TradOpt right now, but there's one test that is failing, but I think there was a flawed assumption in the test based off this new change. So that should be something new coming to TradOpt soon. So currently, Cartesian waypoints must reach the exact position. This is often requiring like sub-millimeter accuracy beyond what a manipulator could do. So it's kind of ridiculous to hold our motion planner to those level of constraints, because almost all real applications have available tolerance, whether it's like sanding or painting, or even somewhat of a precision process is going to have some tolerance to it. So this PR basically allows for users to specify tolerance. So here's a good example I did with the scan and plan workshop demo. So you can see here, this is actually a failed TradOpt plan. Like everything looks all good and really smooth. But for some reason, TradOpt could not converge to meet all the waypoint constraints and the collision constraints. Something about this task, it had to move it just slightly and it was going to fail one of the constraints. And so by applying a tolerance, it was able to succeed. And you'll see the resulting toolpath. It's a little bit smoother, but it looks almost exactly the same, and it follows all of the waypoints quite precisely. And so just by allowing a little bit of, like, give it a centimeter in the X and Y direction relative to the waypoints, a millimeter in the Z direction, and then a little bit of rotation, and roll and pitch, and then free Z rotation, which this previous one also had free Z rotation. But by allowing all of this, it went from a failed path to a successful path and basically the exact same motion. So I'm excited about this because I've had way too many times where my motion planning fails because a few Cartesian waypoints or a couple collision are unavoidable given the strict constraints of the waypoints. So yeah, this should be coming soon and available in Tesseract. It is open in a pull request if you want to just pull that down. But yeah, I'm excited about that. I think it should really increase our success rate in motion planning and benefit a lot of people. But yeah, I think that's about it. Oh yeah, one other thing I was going to mention. We're also currently converting another task in the scan and plan workshop. So we had this TCP speed limiter because we had this issue with the HC10 robot and the automate demo, the automate scan and plan workshop demo, where basically the robot controller itself would limit its motion based off the TCP speed. And so that was previously just hard-coded, baked into the motion planning task or the motion planning server node. And so we are separating that out and making it a plugin task. So Yolnun has been, one of our coworkers has been doing work on that. And so you can see kind of the process of going through that if you look at this pull request of taking it out of the planning server file and then making it into a custom task. And so that way we can put this specifically and only use this specifically for the application that's using the HC10. But I think that's all I have to share.
Thanks, Tyler. I appreciate it. Any questions for Tyler, Michael, or myself? I think right now I just typically make it open forum.
Matt, did you want to do an update on Sword?
That's right. Sorry, Michael. Yeah,
share.
Michael has a Sword update. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, no worries.
That's why
saw
you're
that it was slightly different. Let's see. Sorry, I'm trying to find my share screen button here. Yeah. Okay. You see the Sword thing? Okay.
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so for those of you who are unfamiliar, we've been working on a project here at SWRI. I think Matt touched on it, called Sword, with the idea being that we're trying to incorporate a lot of these sort of ROS-I toolpath and motion planning tools and URDF building capabilities into a CAD environment based on feedback from the membership. So just a couple updates there. We have sort of an official alpha release plan for early January 2024. I think we'll still have sort of like a couple of tiers of Sword, right? Like I think some of you have participated in the beta. I think we'll still have sort of a free version of Sword that has maybe limited capability and is maybe like time limited as well, but something where you can kind of just pull it down and play around with it, and we'll make the tutorials and everything available to kind of allow you to kick the tires. But I think the official release is coming relatively soon. We've been doing a little bit of work, maybe not as much as we wanted to, on some sort of new features, but some things to sort of look forward to in later versions of Sword, right? Is export to robot native files, right? So we've built in these capabilities of being able to like put together a URDF, sort of graphically define all these like planning related artifacts, like a lot of collision matrices and like planning groups, and set up motion planners and all that sort of stuff, and generate trajectories. And so this is sort of like the final piece to sort of get a usable artifact out of Sword, is being able to create robot native files out of these trajectories via RoboDK. So we're also been working on sort of CAD to path, right? Being able to put in some actual like CAD file of a thing and be able to generate waypoints directly off of like surfaces and edges and things like that. Still planning to integrate with Nether too, right? So you can put an arbitrary mesh in there and be able to do all the same sort of tool path planning. And I think we'll hopefully leverage some of the GUI work that we've been adding to Nether as a part of integrating it into Sword, right? And we've been talking about sort of this meta planning integration, right? That's, I think, something that's on our roadmap for Sword too. And then adding sort of other planning sort of modalities, like having remote TCPs, right? If you guys have seen that sort of like puzzle piece grinding demo where you have a static grinder and the robot holds the work piece, right? That's something that we're sort of planning on adding into Sword as well. So the other thing I wanted to touch on too, in addition to sort of like the release stuff, is that, like Matt was saying, we've done a couple of different trainings on motion planning, sort of using Sword as a sandbox to teach this. And I thought it's been sort of a really nice tool for being able to sort of conceptually talk about how the motion planners work, and sort of giving you sort of the buttons to press here to directly see how changing motion planners and changing configurations results in different trajectories with different types of setups. So I personally would be really interested in putting on another sort of like training class around like tuning motion planners, sort of using Sword as the sandbox there. But I think it's been really helpful to sort of have this tool that makes that iteration cycle a little bit shorter, right? And so like currently, the way that we do this is we have to set up this whole application where we write a bunch of code and hard code like configuration parameters for motion planners, and then we compile it and we run it and we see what it does, and then we go back to the code and we change it and we recompile and see what the change does, and that cycle just takes a really long time. But with Sword, we can sort of reduce that to, you know, matters of minutes, right? Where we like change the parameters, run a trajectory, we save it in the GUI, we look at it, we change some parameters, we run another motion plan, saves it in the GUI, we look at it, and you can compare back and forth. So I think that's been really cool. So if you guys are have interest in sort of learning more about motion planners and using Sword to do that, please let us know. I think I can send you some content that I generated for these other sort of training classes I've already put on here, if that's something you guys just want to sort of review internally. But like I said, let us know if this is an interest area for you guys, and I think we'd be happy to sort of incorporate this into a ROS training or sort of remote training as well. But yeah, that's all I wanted to share about Sword. So thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Michael. We're excited. We actually have a URL reserved. It's just not live yet. So there's actually a website with like more like poke at it content, some other like videos of it kind of working, and a little bit more like, so to speak, information. The hang up has been license integration. It's a little bit more cumbersome than we originally hoped, but we're getting there, and come whatever we have to do, we'll get early January. We kind of have like a really hard, we have to get it out, right? So with that said, I just have one of my boilerplate that I have some, I know we set this till 11, but if anyone wants to raise anything of interest, or we're happy take field questions or comments, or there's something we didn't touch on today that you're curious about, I'll shut up for a minute and you guys can chime in. All right, I'll take the silence as everyone's ready to run to wrap up the calendar year. As always, these are our sort of references, kind of where things live. So look forward to this video. This video will be up on the ROS Industrial YouTube channel. So I will make posts all over the place, LinkedIn, Discourse, and include it in a member email. If you're not getting member emails and your organization is a member, please let me know. They may also go onto your junk box, but I said for a few of these initiatives, I'll just be emailing you all directly. So stay tuned for that. I will be populating the training events soon, so at least on the calendar, and of course pushing out the developer meetings. If you have special content you'd like to see for America's hosted developer meeting, also don't hesitate to reach out, right? So obviously we try to cook up the latest things going on. As you can see, this last quarter has been plenty going on with Bridges and Nether and Tesseract. But if there's something specific you'd like a little insight to for the developer meeting that happens on the America side 4 times a year, raise those things, right? Again, Discourse, email, LinkedIn, pick your communication. You can even hit Twitter, or X as it's referred to now. So those are all valid communication channels. With that said, thank you as always. We look forward to seeking out ways to collaborate, if you will, and reach out if you need a hand, right? So we're here, we're excited to help. My email address is here. That's all I got. I'll stay silent and hang out on the line if anyone has questions. Thank you, Michael and Tyler, for each of you basically dialing in and supporting this from vacation. Have a great end of year, and thank you guys for all your work this year. And thank you to those attending and those who've supported the consortium. We look forward to an exciting 2024. So that's all I got. Again, I'll hang on the line. And if anyone wants to hang out and chat, I'll be here. Thanks.
Sure.